He was a man who carried more weight on his shoulders than most could ever imagine. Life had been unkind, but he never let it break him. He was a single father, raising his little daughter all on his own. Every morning, he woke up early, made her breakfast, and walked her to school before heading to work. He didn't have much money, and his clothes were often worn out, but his daughter never noticed those things. To her, he was the strongest man in the world. She would often run to him at the end of the day, arms wide open, waiting for that warm hug. To her, he was her hero. To him, she was the reason he kept moving forward, no matter how tired he felt. He knew life wasn't easy, but he also knew that she deserved the best he could give. And so he tried. Every single day. At his workplace, he wasn't one of the big people. He wasn't in charge of anything important. He was just another face in the crowd, working quietly, doing his tasks, and making sure he didn't cause trouble. He wasn't the kind of person anyone paid much attention to. But he didn't mind. His real world wasn't in the office. His real world was at home, in the little apartment where his daughter waited for him with stories from school, drawings she made, and questions about life that only he could answer. Sometimes, when she asked for things, his heart broke a little because he couldn't always afford them. He wanted to give her everything she wished for, but his wallet didn't agree. Still, he found small ways to make her happy. On weekends, he would take her to the park, buy her a cheap ice cream, and sit with her on the swings. She would laugh and hold his hand, and in those moments, he felt like the richest man alive. One evening, as he was finishing his shift, his manager announced that the company would be having a small celebration at the office. Everyone was asked to bring something sweet to share. It wasn't mandatory, but it was encouraged. For many, this was just a small thing. But for him, it felt bigger. He wanted to fit in, to not be seen as the quiet man who never joined in. Maybe this was his chance to do something simple, to be part of the group. He walked home that night thinking about it. His daughter noticed he looked a little lost in thought. She tugged at his sleeve and asked, "What's wrong, Dad?" He smiled, shook his head, and said, "Nothing, sweetheart. Just thinking about tomorrow." She tilted her head, curious, and asked again. This time he explained, "There's a party at work. Everyone has to bring dessert. I don't know what to bring." Her eyes lit up, the way only a child's eyes could. "Bring cake, Dad. Everyone loves cake," she said with excitement. He laughed softly. "Cake, yes, but cakes from the bakery were expensive, at least the ones that looked good enough to put on a table at the office." He didn't want to show up with something that looked too cheap, but he also couldn't afford the fancy ones. That night, he sat at the kitchen table after putting his daughter to bed. He opened his wallet and counted the money he had left. Rent was due soon. Groceries needed to be bought. There wasn't much to spare. Still, he decided he would try. Tomorrow, on his way to work, he would stop by the bakery and see what he could find. The next morning he left early, kissed his daughter on the forehead, and told her he'd be home soon. On the way, he stopped at a small shop. The glass display was filled with colorful desserts, tall cakes with perfect frosting, pastries decorated with fruit, and sweets that looked like they belonged in magazines. His eyes moved from one to another, and then they stopped on something simple. A small dessert, not fancy, not colorful, just plain. But it was the only one he could afford. He hesitated for a moment. He imagined walking into the office, setting it on the table next to the others. Would people laugh? Would they judge him? He swallowed hard and told himself it didn't matter. What mattered was that he brought something. What mattered was that he tried. So he paid for it, thanked the shopkeeper, and carefully carried it with him. As he entered the office, he noticed his coworkers already arranging their desserts. Big boxes from popular bakeries, trays of rich sweets, cakes decorated with perfection. His hands tightened on the small bag he was holding. He felt smaller than ever, but he forced a smile and placed his dessert quietly on the corner of the table. No one seemed to notice at first, and maybe that was better. But as the day went on, whispers started. A few people glanced at his contribution, exchanged looks, and smiled faintly. He pretended not to see. Inside, he felt that familiar sting of being different, of not measuring up. He wanted to disappear. But then he reminded himself, He hadn't come here to impress anyone. He came because he wanted to be part of something. He came because he wanted to belong, even just a little. What he didn't know was that his small choice, the dessert he thought would embarrass him, would soon open a door to a moment no one in that room would ever forget. Especially the most powerful man in the building, the CEO himself. The office was buzzing that morning. Decorations had been put up, tables lined with treats, and people moving around with cheerful energy. For most, it was just another company event, an excuse to eat sweets and laugh with colleagues. But for him, it felt different. It was the first time in a long while he had stepped out of his comfort zone to join in. He stood quietly near his desk, pretending to focus on some papers, but his eyes drifted toward the table where all the desserts were displayed. His small contribution sat in the corner, almost hidden behind the larger boxes. Bright, colorful cakes took the spotlight, while his looked dull and unimportant in comparison. He tried not to let it bother him, but deep down, he felt a twinge of regret. As people began gathering around, he heard bits of conversation. "Wow, look at that chocolate cake," someone said. Another voice chimed in. "Who brought the strawberry tart? It looks amazing." Laughter followed, the kind of laughter that comes easily when people are proud of what they brought. No one mentioned his dessert. He told himself it was fine. After all, he hadn't done this to compete. He did it to be part of something, to at least show up. That should have been enough. And yet, he couldn't stop that heavy feeling settling in his chest. When the event officially started, the manager gave a short speech, thanking everyone for their hard work and encouraging everyone to enjoy the treats together. People clapped politely before rushing to the table. One by one, they picked slices of the big cakes, the colorful pastries, the desserts that looked perfect for pictures. His dessert remained untouched, sitting quietly as though it didn't belong. He stood in the back of a room, trying to make himself invisible. His mind drifted to his daughter. He could almost hear her voice saying, "Don't worry, Dad. Dessert is dessert. It doesn't matter what it looks like." He smiled faintly at the thought, even though his heart still felt heavy. And then, something unexpected happened. The CEO walked in. The room went silent for a moment. Everyone respected him, but also feared him a little. He was known for being strict, always serious, and rarely emotional. When he entered a room, people straightened their backs, lowered their voices, and paid attention. He moved slowly toward the dessert table, his eyes scanning over the colorful spread. People watched closely, curious about what he would choose. He passed by the large cakes, the fancy sweets, the carefully decorated pastries. And then he stopped. His eyes fell on the small dessert in the corner, the one nobody else had touched. He reached out, picked up a piece, and for a moment, simply stared at it. The room was so quiet you could hear the sound of his fork breaking through the soft crust. He took a bite, and everyone waited, unsure of what would happen. At first, his expression gave nothing away. But then, something shifted. His jaw tightened slightly, and he set the fork down. His hand moved to his mouth, as if he was trying to hold something back. A hush fell over the crowd. People exchanged nervous glances. No one could understand what was happening. The man who had brought the dessert lowered his eyes, embarrassed. Maybe the taste wasn't good. Maybe it had upset the CEO. His stomach sank, and for a moment, he wished he could disappear from the room entirely. But then he heard it, a sound no one expected. The CEO's voice shaking. This tastes just like," he couldn't finish the sentence. His eyes filled with tears, and he quickly wiped them. But it was too late. Everyone had seen. The strongest man in the company, the one who never showed weakness, was crying. People froze, unsure of what to do. The man who had brought the dessert stood still, feeling his heart race. He had no idea what was happening, no idea why his simple, plain dessert had caused such a reaction. The CEO turned away from the table for a moment, covering his face with his hand. The room was completely silent now. Nobody dared to speak. The air was heavy with confusion and curiosity. Finally, the CEO turned back, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. "This dessert, it reminds me of my mother. She used to make this for me when I was a child. It was our special treat, even when we had nothing." His voice cracked again, and he paused to steady himself. The employees were stunned. They had never heard him speak like this. They had never seen this side of him, vulnerable, emotional, human. The single father stood quietly in the back, his heart pounding. He hadn't expected any of this. What he thought was a mistake, what he thought would bring him embarrassment, had instead unlocked a memory buried deep in the CEO's heart. At that moment, the dessert on the table was no longer just food. It was a connection. It was a reminder that sometimes the simplest things carry the heaviest weight. The CEO didn't touch any other desserts. He didn't compliment the expensive cakes or the fancy sweets. He just kept looking at that one small dish, as if it held a piece of his past. And the man who brought it? He stood silently, realizing that maybe, just maybe, his choice wasn't wrong at all. Maybe it was exactly what needed to be there that day. What none of them knew yet was that this moment would change how the CEO saw him, and how everyone else in the room would see him too. The room remained heavy with silence. Everyone had seen it. The CEO, a man who was always composed, had been moved to tears by a single bite of dessert. The employees didn't know where to look. Some glanced nervously at one another, unsure if they should say something, while others kept their eyes on the ground, afraid to draw attention to themselves. The single father, standing quietly in the back, felt his hands grow clammy. He had never expected such a reaction. In his mind, he kept replaying the moment he bought the dessert that morning. He had been worried it would look too plain, too small, too simple compared to the grand cakes his coworkers proudly carried in. He had even thought about skipping the celebration entirely, just to avoid embarrassment. And now here he was, watching the most powerful man in the company struggling to hold back tears because of it. The CEO set down his fork and cleared his throat. His voice was quieter than usual, but every person in the room hung on his words. "You all see this dessert here," he began, pointing at the small dish. "To most, it looks ordinary, nothing special. But to me, it means more than any of you can imagine." The employees leaned forward, listening. They had never heard him speak with such emotion. He continued, "When I was young, my family didn't have much. In fact, we had very little. But my mother, she always found a way to make us feel cared for. She couldn't afford expensive treats, but once in a while, she would make this dessert. It was simple, plain, nothing fancy. But to me, it was the sweetest thing in the world. Every time I see it, every time I taste it, I remember her. I remember the love she poured into everything, even when life gave her nothing in return." The room was completely still. Some of the employees blinked rapidly, as though fighting back their own emotions. They were used to seeing their leader as a man of power, someone untouchable. And now he stood before them, speaking of love, loss, and a mother's sacrifice. The father in the back lowered his eyes, his heart heavy. He had not meant to stir up such memories. He only wanted to contribute something, to not feel left out. He never thought it would unravel such a deep part of someone else's life. The CEO took a breath, his voice trembling slightly. "She's been gone for many years now. And yet, here I am, tasting this again. And it feels like she's standing right beside me. Do you know how rare that is? To be taken back, even for a moment, to the arms of someone you've lost? This dessert did that for me, today." He looked around the room, his eyes searching. "Who brought this?" he asked. The father froze. For a moment, he thought about staying silent, letting someone else take the credit, but his conscience wouldn't allow it. Slowly, nervously, he raised his hand. The CEO's eyes found him. For a second, the room seemed to shrink, and it was just the two of them, standing on opposite ends of the space. The father's chest tightened, unsure of what would come next. Would the CEO thank him? Would he ask why he chose something so simple? The CEO's face softened, and he nodded once, almost as if to say, "I understand." Everyone else in the room stared, shocked. They had barely noticed the quiet man before. He was the kind of employee who blended into the background, never drawing attention. And yet, here he was, the reason their boss was standing before them with tears in his eyes. The father wanted to explain, to say he hadn't meant to make anyone cry, that he had simply picked up the only thing he could afford. but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and certainly not in front of the entire company. The CEO seemed to sense his discomfort and didn't push. Instead, he turned back to the group. "Let this be a reminder," he said, his voice steadier now. "Sometimes we get caught up in appearances. We think the most expensive, the biggest, the fanciest things are what matter. But often it's the simplest things, the things made with love, that carry the deepest meaning. Never forget that." A few people nodded. Some even lowered their heads in shame. They had laughed quietly at the father's dessert earlier, thinking it unworthy of the table. And now, they realized how wrong they had been. The father felt a strange mix of relief and discomfort. Relief that his choice had not been a disaster, but discomfort that so many eyes were now on him. He wasn't used to being noticed, and he wasn't sure he wanted to be. But at the same time, deep down, a small warmth grew in his chest. Maybe, for once, being himself was enough. The celebration continued, but it felt different now. The laughter was softer, the conversations more thoughtful. And though many still reached for the larger cakes, some finally took pieces of the simple dessert, tasting it for themselves. Each bite seemed to carry more weight now, as if it had been transformed by the story they had just heard. The CEO didn't linger at the party for long, but before he left, he paused by the table once more. He picked up another small piece of the dessert, closed his eyes as he ate it, and walked out quietly. No one dared to stop him. The father stood there, his hands resting at his sides, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had only wanted to fit in, to not stand out in the wrong way. And instead, he had unknowingly touched the heart of the man everyone thought was unshakable. As the room slowly returned to its usual noise, the father couldn't help but think of his daughter again. He imagined telling her about the day, how the dessert they had talked about, the one she had been so excited for him to bring, had made the CEO cry. She would laugh in disbelief. She would probably say something like, "See, Dad? I told you dessert makes people happy." He smiled at the thought. Maybe she was right. Maybe dessert really did have a way of bringing out emotions no one expected. But deep down, he knew this was about more than food. This was about memory, about love, about how the smallest, simplest things could reach into the deepest corners of someone's heart. And little did he know, this moment was only the beginning of something much bigger. The celebration carried on, but the energy in the room was no longer the same. It felt softer, more thoughtful. People had been shaken by what they witnessed. The CEO's reaction was something no one could have predicted. The man they thought of as untouchable, almost machine-like in his discipline, had revealed a side no one had seen before, fragile, emotional, deeply human. Conversations resumed, but in hushed tones. Some employees kept glancing at the simple dessert on the table, as though it had suddenly transformed into something sacred. A few even picked up small portions, almost nervously, tasting it as if they might feel some of the emotion their boss had felt. The single father stayed quiet in the back, hands tucked into his pockets. He didn't seek attention, didn't want to stand in the center of anything. Yet he could feel the shift in how people looked at him. Colleagues who rarely acknowledged him now stole quick glances, some with respect, others with curiosity. He wasn't sure how to react. A part of him wanted to shrink back, to avoid all of it. But another part of him, the part that remembered how often he had felt invisible, felt a strange warmth. For once, people noticed him. And it wasn't because of a mistake or failure. It was because of something that had touched another human being's heart. Not long after, the CEO returned. He had left the room earlier, but now he walked back in with calmer steps, his usual composed look back on his face, though his eyes were still softer than before. The chatter died down as soon as he entered. He moved toward the dessert table again, but instead of going straight to the sweets, he turned his attention to the employees. "I want to say something," he began. His voice carried the same authority it always had, but now it was mixed with something gentler. "Earlier, you all saw me react in a way you've never seen before. Some of you may have been surprised, maybe even uncomfortable. But I need you to understand something." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We are not just employees or managers or titles on a piece of paper. We are people. and people carry stories. Behind every face you see in this room is a history, a struggle, a memory, or a love that has shaped them. Today, a simple dessert reminded me of mine. It reminded me of my mother, who taught me what it means to care for others, even when you have little to give. The employees were silent, many nodding slowly. His tone was unlike any speech he had ever given at work. He continued, "We live in a world that celebrates the big things, the grand gestures, the expensive gifts, the showy displays. But I want you all to remember this. Sometimes, the most ordinary things carry the most extraordinary meaning. Today proved that." As he spoke, his eyes wandered again toward the dessert. Then, deliberately, he looked up and found the single father in the crowd. He didn't call him forward, didn't embarrass him. But their eyes met, and in that brief moment, a message was exchanged, one of respect, gratitude, and recognition. The father lowered his gaze humbly, his heart pounding. He had never expected this. He had never wanted the spotlight. But something inside him shifted. For once, he didn't feel small. He didn't feel like just another worker blending into the background. He felt seen. After the CEO finished speaking, the event continued, though in a quieter and more respectful atmosphere. People ate, laughed softly, and shared stories, but the tone had changed completely. What was supposed to be a light-hearted office party had turned into a moment of reflection. The father eventually sat down at a corner table, sipping a cup of tea. He thought about the irony of it all. He had been so worried that his dessert would embarrass him, that people would judge him for not being able to bring something grand. And yet, that very choice had sparked something so much bigger than he ever imagined. A few coworkers approached him, some with awkward smiles, others with genuine warmth. One of them said softly, "That was really something. You reminded us all today that life isn't about appearances." Another simply patted his shoulder and said, "Good job." He nodded politely, not sure how to respond. He wasn't used to praise, and he didn't quite know what to do with it. Still, he appreciated the small gestures. They made him feel like, for once, he belonged. Later, as the event wound down, he gathered his things and prepared to leave. He carefully placed the nearly empty dish back into the bag he had brought it in. To his surprise, it was no longer untouched. Half of it was gone. People had eaten it after all. He smiled faintly to himself. On his way out, he passed through the hallway when he suddenly heard footsteps behind him. Turning slightly, he realized it was the CEO. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure whether to stop or keep walking, but before he could decide, the CEO called out. "Wait a moment," the CEO said. The father turned fully, standing still as the older man approached. The CEO looked at him directly, his expression calm but sincere. "That dessert, it meant a lot to me today. I just wanted to thank you personally." The father swallowed, unsure what to say. I'm glad," he managed, his voice quiet. The CEO studied him for a moment, then asked, "What made you bring it?" The father hesitated. He didn't want to admit it was the only thing he could afford, that he had picked it out of desperation. But he also didn't want to lie. So, he spoke simply. "It was what I could manage. I didn't think it was much, but I thought it was better than showing up with nothing." The CEO nodded slowly, almost knowingly. Sometimes, what we think is small ends up being the most meaningful of all. Never underestimate that. With those words, he gave a faint smile, something employees rarely ever saw from him, and walked away, leaving the father standing there in stunned silence. As he walked out of the building into the cool evening air, the father felt lighter than he had in a long time. He thought about his daughter waiting for him at home, her eager face ready to hear about his day. He couldn't wait to tell her the story. Not about the CEO, not about the office whispers, but about how something so simple could carry so much power. For the first time in a long time, he felt proud. And though he didn't know it yet, this small moment would change more than just one afternoon at the office. It would leave an impression on the people around him, and perhaps even open doors he never thought possible. That evening, the office slowly emptied out. The celebration was over, but the weight of what had happened still lingered in the air. People walked out in groups, whispering to one another about the CEO's reaction. Some tried to brush it off as just a passing moment, but deep inside, no one could deny that it had shaken them. They had seen their leader cry, and not because of weakness, but because of memory. The single father left quietly, carrying the half-empty dish with him. At home, his daughter ran into his arms the moment he stepped through the door. She asked about the party, her eyes wide with curiosity. He smiled, hugged her tightly, and said it was different. "I'll tell you all about it." But before he could explain it to her, something else was happening back at the CEO's home. The CEO sat alone at his dining table that night. The house was large, far too large for one man to fill. He had built a life of success, a life many envied. Yet as he looked around at the polished furniture and quiet rooms, it all felt empty. On the table in front of him was a small plate. He had carried one last piece of that dessert home with him. It sat there now untouched, as though it carried more weight than food should. He stared at it, his mind drifting back decades to a much smaller, humbler table. He closed his eyes, and he was a boy again. He could see his mother in the kitchen, her hands rough from years of work. The house was tiny, the cupboards almost bare. He remembered the sound of her humming as she tried to make something out of almost nothing. And then he remembered the smell, sweet, warm, comforting. That simple dessert. They couldn't afford much, but she always found a way to make it for him and his siblings on special days. He could still see her smile when she placed it on the table, as if she was giving them a feast. To him, it wasn't just food. It was proof that she loved them enough to give them everything she had, even when she had nothing. Tears welled in his eyes as the memory flooded back. He had spent years burying that part of his life. When he grew older, he chased success, wealth, and power. He worked endlessly to escape the poverty that had once defined him. And in doing so, he had tucked away those memories of struggle, memories of his mother, who had given so much but lived with so little. But one bite of that dessert had brought it all back. The taste was exactly the same. It was as if time had folded in on itself, and for one fleeting moment, she was there again. He could almost hear her voice, soft and reassuring, telling him not to give up. He wiped his eyes, his heart aching with both grief and gratitude. He had lost her many years ago, but the love she had poured into him remained. That dessert was proof of it, a reminder that love could be carried through the smallest, simplest things. The next day, he gathered his leadership team. They were used to strict meetings, to long discussions about profits, deadlines, and performance. But this time, the CEO spoke differently. "I want to share something with all of you," he began. His voice was steady, but his eyes were serious. "Yesterday, many of you saw my reaction to a certain dessert. I want you to understand why." The room fell silent. Some exchanged glances, unsure of what was about to unfold. He continued, "When I was a child, we were very poor. My mother raised us alone, and life was not easy. But she never let us feel unloved. On special occasions, when there was barely enough food on the table, she would make a dessert that became our family's treasure. It wasn't expensive or beautiful, but to us, it meant the world. It was love baked into something simple." His voice softened as he added, "Yesterday, for the first time in decades, I tasted it again. And it broke me, because it reminded me of everything she sacrificed, everything she gave, and everything I built my life upon. It reminded me that sometimes the simplest things carry the greatest meaning." The room was silent. Many of his team had never seen him speak like this. It was raw, vulnerable, unpolished, but it was real. He leaned back in his chair, sighing softly. "I've built a company that strives for perfection, that chases big wins and grand results. But maybe we've lost sight of something important. Maybe we need to remember that the heart of everything we do is not just business. It's people. It's love. It's the stories we carry." His words struck deeply. For years, employees had seen him as a man who cared only for numbers. But now they saw something different, a man shaped by struggle, a man who still carried his mother's love inside him, even after all these years. Meanwhile, the single father, back at his own small apartment, tucked his daughter into bed. She listened wide-eyed as he told her the story of what had happened. How the CEO had cried, how everyone had gone silent, how a simple dessert had changed the atmosphere of an entire room. His daughter giggled and said, "See, Dad? Dessert makes people happy." He chuckled, stroking her hair. "Yes, sweetheart. Sometimes it does. But sometimes it does a lot more than that." As he sat alone later that night, he thought about it deeply. He had always felt small compared to others, his clothes, his home, his life. But now he realized something important. It wasn't the size of the gift that mattered. It wasn't how perfect or expensive it looked. What mattered was the heart behind it. And for the first time in a long while, he felt proud of himself. The days after the celebration carried a different atmosphere at the office. Something subtle had shifted. The employees, who once thought only of deadlines, targets, and competition, now looked at one another with a little more warmth. Conversations were softer, greetings a little kinder. And at the center of this quiet change was a dessert no one had expected to matter. The single father returned to work as usual, slipping into his routines. He didn't expect anything to be different. In fact, he hoped things would go back to normal, that people would forget about the attention and let him fade quietly into the background again. But it didn't happen that way. Co-workers who used to walk past him without notice now nodded or smiled when they saw him. A few even stopped to chat briefly, asking about his daughter or how his evening had been. Small gestures, but meaningful ones. For the first time, he didn't feel invisible. He felt included. The CEO, too, was different. Though he remained strict in his work, there was a gentleness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He greeted employees with a little more patience, listened a little longer, and carried himself not just as a leader of a company, but as a man who remembered what it meant to be human. One afternoon, as the father was finishing his tasks, he was called into the CEO's office. His heart pounded as he walked down the hall, clutching his worn notebook. He had never been summoned like this before. When he entered, the CEO wasn't sitting behind his large desk like usual. Instead, he was by the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the city below. The room was quiet, filled only with the distant hum of traffic. "Come in," the CEO said without turning. His voice was calm, almost gentle. The father stepped inside nervously, unsure of why he had been called. The CEO turned then, his face serious but not cold. "I wanted to speak with you personally," he said. He gestured for the father to sit. "That dessert you brought, it meant more than I can put into words. I've already said it in front of others, but I want you to know, from me to you, that it reminded me of something I had lost. And for that, I'm grateful." The father shifted in his seat, humbled. "I didn't mean to cause such a reaction," he said softly. "I only brought what I could." The CEO nodded. "And that's exactly the point. You brought what you could. You gave what was within your reach. That's more powerful than people realize. Too often we think we have to show off, to compete, to prove our worth through things that shine. But in truth, sincerity, honesty, carries a weight that no wealth can replace." He paused, then leaned forward slightly. "Never forget that. Not just here, but in your life. Sometimes, what feels small to you might mean everything to someone else." The father nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to say thank you, but the words felt too simple for the moment. Before he left, the CEO added, "I don't share much about my personal life, but that dessert reminded me of my mother. She's gone now, but for a moment, it felt like she was with me again. That's not something I can repay. But know this, you made me remember what really matters." The father walked out of the office in silence, his heart heavy, but full. For years, he had lived quietly, unnoticed, doing his best with what little he had. And now he realized that even small acts, even mistakes, as he had thought it at first, could leave a mark greater than he could imagine. That night, when he returned home, his daughter once again ran into his arms, her laughter filling the tiny apartment. As he tucked her into bed, she asked about his day. He smiled and said, "Sometimes the things we think are small end up being very big. Today, I learned that." She tilted her head in confusion, too young to fully understand. But one day she would. Meanwhile, the CEO sat alone in his office late into the evening. On his desk, a small notebook lay open. Inside, he had written just a single line: "Never forget the power of simplicity." Never forget the power of love. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. The dessert was gone, but the memory it had awakened remained. And he knew, deep in his heart, that it wasn't just about food. It was about people. It was about the love that mothers give, the sacrifices fathers make, the struggles that go unseen, and the way even the smallest actions can bring light into someone's darkest corner. From that day on, he led differently. Not weaker, not softer, but more human. And the employees noticed. Slowly, the company culture shifted. It wasn't just about profit anymore. It was about connection. About remembering that behind every desk, every uniform, every tired smile, there was a story. And as for the single father, he didn't become rich overnight. His life wasn't magically transformed. But something inside him changed forever. He stopped seeing himself as less than others. He stopped believing that what he brought to the table was too small. He carried himself with quiet confidence, knowing that sometimes what you think is nothing at all could mean everything to someone else. And so the story of one wrong dessert, the dessert he thought would bring him shame, became the story that reminded an entire room of people about love, humility, and the hidden weight of simple things.